Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel NPA Discovery. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating, controversial, and often misunderstood stories in Hollywood history, the rise and fall of George Lazenby, the man who played James Bond just once and then walked away. Now, the title of today's video poses a bold claim: has George Lazenby become a symbol of squandered opportunity, a cautionary tale for every actor who lets arrogance and poor judgment sabotage their own career? Or, is he instead a misunderstood maverick, someone who made a decision true to himself, even if the world never forgave him for it? Personally, I think the truth lies somewhere in between. George Lazenby's story isn't just about James Bond. It's about how fame, opportunity, ego, and timing can collide in explosive ways. His life reminds us that sometimes, one wrong move or one stubborn choice can change everything. Before we get into the details, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps us motivated to bring you more powerful stories from the world of entertainment, fame, and history. So let's begin our journey, starting not with James Bond, but with a sickly boy in Australia who wasn't even expected to live past childhood. George Lazenby was born in 1939, in the small town of Goulburn, Australia. His beginnings were far from glamorous. His father worked for the railways, and his mother was a store clerk, humble, working-class people. No one in their neighborhood would have guessed that this little boy would one day take on one of the most iconic roles in cinematic history. But here's the thing, George almost didn't make it at all. As a child, he endured multiple surgeries, spending nearly a year and a half in the hospital. By the end of it, doctors told his family he'd be lucky to reach the age of 12. Think about that. You're a kid, frail, weak, your parents constantly worried that every day could be your last. And yet, this boy who wasn't supposed to survive past childhood grew into a 6'2", broad-shouldered, fearless man. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The very man who shouldn't have survived life ended up being cast as the world's greatest survivor, James Bond. The move that changed everything. By his early 20s, George was restless. He had little direction but a lot of charm. Then came the turning point. He fell for a woman he believed was far out of his league. When she moved to England, George, driven by a mixture of passion and impulse, followed. Now, on the surface, this seems like pure romance. But if we peel back the layers, it was also the first sign of a pattern in Lazenby's life. He would act first, without much planning, guided by instinct, bravado, and emotion. Sometimes that boldness would lead to incredible opportunities. Other times, it would cost him dearly. Arriving in London, he had no plan, no contacts, not even a clear idea of where this woman was. But instead of heading home, he stayed. He hustled, landing a job as a car salesman, and soon after, fate intervened. A talent scout spotted him, and just like that, George became one of the most in-demand male models of the 1960s. It's worth pausing here. In the world of modeling, Lazenby found himself celebrated for the very things that had saved him as a child: his physicality, his ruggedness, his confidence. He wasn't an actor yet, but he was a presence. And presence is what Hollywood thrives on. The accidental encounter with destiny. Fast forward to 1968. Sean Connery, the original James Bond, announced he was stepping away from the role after You Only Live Twice. Producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were desperate for a replacement. And then, in what feels like a scene straight out of a movie itself, Broccoli spotted Lazenby in a barber's shop. Here was this tall, striking man who looked like he'd been carved out of marble. He had the raw, masculine charisma that Bond demanded. George, ever bold, leaned into the opportunity. He showed up to his screen test in a Rolex Submariner, just like Bond wore, and a Savile Row suit that had once been ordered by Connery himself. It was as if he had walked straight out of the pages of Ian Fleming's novels. Now, here's my take. This moment was George's genius. He didn't have acting experience, but he understood the power of image. He knew that half the battle of becoming Bond was looking the part, carrying yourself with the same effortless confidence. And he nailed it. But there was also a darker side to this moment. That same bravado, the swagger that impressed producers, would later become his undoing. The infamous audition. At the actual audition, George overdid it. During a fight sequence, he accidentally punched the stunt coordinator in the face, breaking his nose. Now, let's analyze that. On one hand, this was reckless. On the other, it gave producers exactly what they thought Bond needed: aggression, danger, physical authenticity. In a strange twist of fate, his mistake won him the role. The director, Peter Hunt, said afterward, "We wanted someone who oozed assurance. We thought this fellow had that." It's fascinating, isn't it? In life, sometimes our mistakes can be reinterpreted as strengths if they fit into the narrative others want to see. George's impulsiveness, his flaw, became, in that one moment, his greatest weapon. The beginning of the end. And so, George Lazenby became James Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But if his rise was meteoric, his fall would be just as swift. From day one, he clashed with cast and crew. His co-star, Diana Rigg, famously despised his cockiness. She even plotted revenge, eating garlic before kiss scenes, just to torture him. On set, he played pranks, sometimes injuring colleagues, sometimes sabotaging entire scenes. To me, this behavior wasn't just immaturity, it was insecurity. George knew he wasn't a trained actor. He was surrounded by seasoned professionals who looked down on him. His bravado was a shield, a way to assert control in an environment where he felt out of his depth. But bravado can only take you so far. Clashes, chaos, and the biggest mistake in Hollywood. Welcome back to the channel, friends. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend watching it first, so you'll understand the full journey of George Lazenby, from a sickly child in Australia to suddenly being cast as James Bond, the most coveted role in Hollywood. Now, in this part, we'll dive into what went wrong. Because as exciting as George's rise was, his time as Bond was plagued by tension, mistakes, and one career-ending decision that still shocks Hollywood to this day. So let's get into it. And while we do, don't forget to hit like, share this video, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of George Lazenby's story. The year was 1968. Cameras rolled on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and at first glance, things looked promising. George had the looks, the charm, the aura of Bond. But behind the scenes, his inexperience quickly showed. Unlike Connery, who commanded respect on set, George was treated more like an outsider, a model trying to play an actor. And instead of humbly learning from veterans, George doubled down on arrogance. He believed sheer confidence could carry him through. But here's where reality clashed with ego. He didn't have the craft, the discipline, or the diplomacy that film sets demand. Co-star Diana Rigg, who played Tracy, the only woman Bond ever truly marries, found George unbearable. She thought he was immature, self-obsessed, and disruptive. Their feud became legendary. And here's the famous story: Diana, exasperated, decided to punish him in her own clever way. Before love scenes, she would eat cloves of raw garlic, announcing loudly, "I hope you're doing the same, darling." Imagine being forced to kiss someone with garlic breath just because they wanted to teach you humility. That's not just petty, it's symbolic. It showed how deep the resentment toward George had become. Now, let's pause and analyze. Why was there so much animosity? Was it only George's fault? Partially, yes, he was reckless, often playing pranks, and sometimes causing accidents. But also, the production itself set him up to fail. He was an untrained actor replacing one of the most beloved stars in cinema. The crew resented him for daring to step into Sean Connery's shoes. He wasn't given much support. The director, Peter Hunt, famously refused to guide him, saying, "I want him to figure it out himself." In other words, they threw him into the ocean and expected him to swim. And instead of swimming, George tried to fight the tide with bravado. The poker games and money troubles. Another infamous story from the set reveals just how naive George could be. At the time, the cast were paid in cash, and George carried his salary in a suitcase like a schoolboy showing off his lunchbox. His co-star, Telly Savalas, who played the villain Blofeld, noticed this. Telly invited George to poker games with the crew, and George, too confident in his luck, lost nearly all of his wages. It got so bad that co-producer Harry Saltzman had to step in, join the game himself, and win George's money back. Think about that. You're playing James Bond, the man who beats villains at high-stakes poker tables, and in real life, you're being cleaned out every night like an amateur. It was almost comical, and humiliating. What this shows is a key theme in George's story. He often played the part of Bond on the outside, but in reality, he lacked the cunning and discipline that made Bond Bond. And people noticed. Dangerous stunts and broken bones. Yet, there was one thing George did bring to the table that even Connery hadn't dared to, an insane willingness to do dangerous stunts himself. He threw himself into skiing scenes, fight sequences, and risky moves with almost reckless abandon. At one point, he even suggested that Bond should ski off a cliff and parachute down, a stunt that wasn't used at the time but eventually appeared in 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me. But George's recklessness had consequences. While skiing for the film, he broke his arm. Instead of halting production, the crew worked around it, hiding his injury under costumes and coats. Now, from one angle, this makes him look tough, even heroic. But from another, it highlights his immaturity. He wasn't considering the production costs, the schedules, or the hundreds of crew members depending on him. For Bond, every action is calculated. For Lazenby, it was often impulse. The premiere disaster. When the film was finally completed, George's relationship with the producers was already strained. But the real disaster came at the film's premiere. By this point, George had fallen under the influence of a countercultural crowd who told him Bond was outdated, a symbol of old Hollywood masculinity that had no place in the new world. So, when the cameras rolled and the press arrived, George showed up to the premiere not as Bond, but as a bearded, long-haired hippie. In an instant, he killed the illusion. Imagine this, audiences were about to see him as the world's most suave, clean-cut spy, and yet in real life, he looked more like a roadie for a rock band. It sent the message loud and clear: George Lazenby didn't care about Bond. And that, my friends, was the nail in the coffin. Walking away from Bond. Even more shocking, George made the unprecedented decision to walk away from the role. The producers had offered him a contract for 7 more films. He could have been Bond throughout the 1970s, cementing himself as a household name, earning millions, and perhaps rivaling Sean Connery himself. But he refused. He later claimed that his agent convinced him Bond was finished, that audiences were moving on, and that Clint Eastwood-style westerns would dominate. In hindsight, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Bond franchise went on to thrive, making billions. George's name became synonymous with wasted potential. Analysis: the arrogance of youth. Let's pause here. Why did George do it? I think it comes down to arrogance mixed with insecurity. On the surface, he didn't want to be typecast. But deeper than that, he felt like an outsider in the Bond machine. He wasn't respected. He wasn't trained. He feared being trapped in a role where he'd always be compared unfavorably to Connery. So he chose freedom over security. A bold move, but one that cost him everything. And isn't that a lesson for all of us? Sometimes we walk away from opportunities because of pride, fear, or the advice of the wrong people. And later, we realize those chances don't come twice. After walking away from James Bond, George Lazenby expected Hollywood to roll out the red carpet. Instead, the doors slammed shut. Casting directors saw him as reckless, an unproven actor who had turned down the biggest role in cinema. Overnight, he went from playing the world's most famous spy to struggling for work. Lazenby tried his hand at various projects, low-budget films in Europe and Asia, martial arts pictures, even comedies, but none came close to recapturing the spotlight of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. By the mid-1970s, he was drifting, both professionally and personally, unsure of what path to take. In later years, he admitted that arrogance and bad advice had sabotaged him. His manager at the time convinced him Bond was square, that the role had no future in the counterculture era of the 1970s. Lazenby believed him, thinking that turning down Bond made him a rebel, an anti-establishment figure. Instead, it left him jobless. Yet, Lazenby was nothing if not resilient. He built a life outside of Hollywood, investing wisely, raising a family, and living on his own terms. While other actors chased fame, he embraced an unusual mix of adventures, working in Hong Kong films, dabbling in television, and even stepping away from acting entirely for stretches of time. What he could never escape was the shadow of James Bond. For decades, he was remembered as the one-hit wonder of the franchise. Critics mocked him, fans dismissed him, and his name became a Hollywood cautionary tale. But time has a way of reshaping reputations. As the Bond franchise grew, film historians and fans began to revisit Lazenby's lone outing. They discovered a raw vulnerability in his performance, a Bond who could be tough but also heartbreakingly human. Younger generations, free of the Sean Connery comparisons, saw on Her Majesty's Secret Service as one of the boldest and most emotional entries in the series. By the 2000s, Lazenby had become something of a cult figure, celebrated at fan conventions, invited for interviews, and even starring in documentaries about his life. In 2017, the film Becoming Bond told his astonishing story, how a car salesman bluffed his way into one of the most iconic roles in movie history, only to walk away from it all. Today, George Lazenby is no longer seen as a failure, but as a fascinating outsider, a man who lived by instinct, took risks, and refused to compromise. He may have lost Bond, but he gained something far rarer in Hollywood, the freedom to live life on his own terms. George Lazenby's story is more than just a Hollywood anecdote, it's a parable about risk, regret, and destiny. On the surface, he seemed reckless. He walked away from James Bond, the most bankable role in cinema, and for years, that choice defined him as the man who squandered everything. But look closer, and his decision raises deeper questions. What does it really mean to succeed? Is it wealth, fame, and power, or is it the ability to live life on your own terms? Lazenby's life is a study in contradictions. He regretted turning down Bond, yet he also insisted he would have been miserable living under the franchise's constraints. He lost out on fame, but he gained freedom. He endured personal tragedies, but he carried them with an honesty that made him more relatable than the untouchable heroes he once portrayed. In a way, Lazenby became a Bond of his own making. Not the flawless secret agent, but the rogue who defied the script, who refused to play the part handed to him. For some, that's foolish. For others, it's inspiring. And that's the enduring lesson of George Lazenby. Sometimes the most important choices in life aren't the ones that guarantee success, but the ones that reveal who we really are. His journey reminds us that fame fades, money comes and goes, but authenticity, however messy, however imperfect, endures. George Lazenby's destiny was not to be the longest-serving Bond, or the most famous Bond. His destiny was to be the Bond who broke the rules, who lived boldly, and whose story still sparks debate decades later. Because in the end, the legend of George Lazenby isn't about what he lost, it's about the freedom he gained.